reality therapist perception.
Hello and welcome back to Reactivity TV. We are changing it up a little bit this week, and while we are still giving our therapist take to what we see on TV, we're actually going to be talking about You Season 4, Part 1. What's a mouthful? That was just recently released in February of 2023. And this is a really interesting show to do our therapist takes on because Joe is, to put it lightly, such a flawed character. So I guess we need to, like, as we do as therapists, right? Like, we need to like fully step into the world of our clients and try to just like accept the world as they see it. And
right.
You know, we're not necessarily condoning any sort of psychopathy or sociopathy, but there are some
murder,
murder, you know, framing people for murder, crime.
Mm-hmm.
There are some really interesting things that have been brought to light in this season so far.
Yeah. There's still a lot of things to point out without pointing out the obvious.
Yes. So what for you is one of those things?
I'd like to start with Kate. She went to the pub after the funeral, and Joe, of course, followed her there. And
of course.
And she actually ended up confiding in him and told him about how she has such a hard time with showing her emotions because as a kid, she was told to just zip it up and hide it all. Don't cry. And so here she is at her, was it Malcolm's funeral or was it the other guy?
I think it might have been the artist.
Yeah, you're right. But either way, she's supposed to be like the quote unquote grieving girlfriend right now. And she's not coming off that way because she's stone cold. She is just doesn't know how to show it because she doesn't really know how. And I think that it's a pretty relatable thing for people to also have similar experiences with the way that they show emotions as an adult is very indicative of what was okay or what was accepted in their household growing up. So if you grow up in a household where everybody shows their emotions on their sleeve, then you might be more conditioned to doing that. And if you grow up in a household where you are told to keep it all in, then you're more likely to end up doing that. It's not something that has to stay with you. It's not something that has to stick forever, and certainly can be worked through and redirected. But it is just something that a lot of people deal with. I mean, we are a product of our environment to a big extent. So I just thought that was a very relatable thing that happened. And yeah.
Totally. And you know, at Revive, like in our practice, we think a lot about systems, right? Like, and so you're talking about like a family system's influence on like how someone might learn about how to express their emotions. But there's this other bigger influence or more like macro level influences is the culture in which Kate is a part of. And we hear Adam, like Lucas Gage's character, like kind of allude to that a little bit at whether the reception after the funeral, when he says to Joe, like, oh, like, thank God another American's here. It's kind of weird to like feel emotions around like all of these Brits. And so I thought that was also like an interesting note of like British culture, like often does, like there are different expectations around emotions in that culture. And then like Kate's family culture almost like doubled down on that in a way. And so for her to express emotions is like probably incredibly foreign to her. No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's a great point. No, you're right. What did you find?
So one of the things that like really strikes me about Joe is that he is so good at rationalizing his behavior. and like rationalizing is something that we all do, right? Like rationalizing.
Wait. He is so resourceful.
Stop trolling me. Just being a therapist. I don't know. It's probably a way that he's being resourceful, but but rationalizing is essentially like a defense mechanism. It's something that we do consciously or not in order to maybe justify the decisions that we're making or justify like our experiences. And we see Joe do that all the time. And like to use that like extreme is not an exaggeration. We see him say something like in the first episode, he'll say something like, well, the only way to stay out of someone's business is to know what their business is. And so that justifies his way of like peering into his neighbor's window. Like, no, Joe, like that is not okay. That is not appropriate. On some level, you know that, and you're coming up with a reason, like also known as a rationalization around why you're behaving in the way that you do. And so again, we all do this to some, not necessarily to that degree, but like we often do this to maybe like justify our behavior when we're maybe not totally comfortable or confident in the decision that we're making.
So true. And we just don't want to admit it. We don't want to admit that we don't want to come to terms with what doing that behavior actually means. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of make up this other idea of an alternative that sounds mm-hmm. a little bit better, that sits a little bit better with us, right. That lets us sleep at night.
Yeah, it kind of like gives us permission in some way to like kind of do this thing that we might not like feel totally great about, or people might have judgment around for like, I was going to say for better or worse, but like justified judgment or not. So I thought that like we see Joe do that a lot. And I think maybe like a segue around that is like, we also see Joe like in terms of rationalization. He also really he believes his rationalization. Like I said, like I don't know that so much of it is conscious. And so he'll say things again, like episode 1, he says things like, why does the universe keep doing this to me? And what the universe is quote unquote doing to him is having him stand in his apartment, look across the way and watch his neighbor masturbate. Like, no, Joe, like the universe is not doing that to you. You are making a choice to stand and to spy on your neighbor and invade their privacy. And so I just like thought that's another thing that again, kind of like people can tend to do, is to in some way become a little bit of like the victim of their story when they're not necessarily realizing the part that they're playing in the chaos that surrounds them.
Yeah, so true. It's a way to keep yourself from being accountable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Joe.
Yes, Joe. What else you got?
I was thinking about I was going to say friendship, but like the connection that started to build in the beginning between Joe and Reese, and that Joe felt connected to him immediately because of the memoir that like meant so much to him that Reese wrote, and that in knowing that he wrote that he just knows so much about him already and knows what he like, that he didn't come from much. And they were both these outsiders at this inside event. So I just found it interesting that as connected as Joe felt to Reese from the get-go, that there's like a really big piece that he wasn't thinking about that really, really connected him to Reese.
Mm.
And now I'm thinking about our Wishing You Well podcast episode with Elizabeth, when we're talking about self-acceptance and we're talking about being attuned to yourself and being aware of the things that go on for you, that like Joe is so not attuned with himself. I mean, like you just said, he's just like justifying all these things, but like, does he actually believe these things? Like, he's really not reading into it at all. And had he, maybe he would have realized, well, wait, oh, maybe I'm connecting to this guy because he kills people too.
Well, I mean, in that acceptance piece, I just, like, in preparation for season 4, I rewatched season 3. And so, like, two main things that I'm thinking about from season 3 are, we get a lot of backstory about Joe's upbringing and the, like, significant trauma that he experienced. And of course, like, when we experience traumatic things or really stressful things, it changes our brain. Like, it changes our wiring. It changes the way that we connect and relate to other people. And so that seemed to be a thing that they wanted us to know in season 3. And so they're, like, in a sense, like, Reese and Joe have, like, this connection, like you said, like this bond over as Reese referred to it as, a shit childhood. And so, like, when Joe is feeling throughout his life so misunderstood, so kind of like so much of an outsider, like you said, to find a connection, to find understanding in another, that might make you blind to kind of seeing other things, like other flags. But the other thing, in terms of the acceptance piece that really resonated with me in my rewatch of season 3 is, there's a time where Joe goes on, like, a camping trip with the other men in Madre Linda in the neighborhood. And there's a point where Joe, like, is very aggressive toward one of the other male characters, Carrie. And, like, he's worried they're going to judge him for it. But instead they're like, oh my gosh, like, Joe, you're awesome. Like, look at you embracing your masculinity. And you hear Joe's kind of monologue saying, like, oh my gosh, this darkness within me, they saw it and they are not judging me for it. They're accepting it. And he has this kind of feeling of, like, oh, I've been trying to like keep it under wraps for so long, but, like, maybe there is a way that I can embrace it. Where it's problematic is that Joe, like, leans it, like, his way of embracing it is stalking and murdering people. But there is, like, the bigger lesson to be learned is, like, yeah, when we do not let ourselves, like, accept all the parts of ourselves, even the parts that might be a little bit darker, it really keeps us from being who we really are. And again, like, coming back to what you were saying about this bond between Reese and Joe, I do wonder if there was, again, this part of Joe that felt like, maybe I can find acceptance of myself in another because they might be like me. And I'm curious about how that might play out the rest of part 2 of the season.
Yeah, so true. Imagine they just, like, team up, Batman and Robin, killing spree.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's so interesting, like, and maybe this is a question for another time, but, like, I hope not. Like, I'm rooting for Joe. But I want him to find redemption. And there is something about, like, wow, why are we rooting for this guy? Like, in season 1, I was like, there was an opportunity for him to get caught. And I was, like, nervous, like, stressed, like, but why am I rooting for a murderer? And so there is something that's so interesting, so well done about the show, that they really humanize this character who's so fun.
Right. Well, I wonder if we're rooting for Joe or we're rooting for Dan Humphrey.
There it is.
Yeah. The less controversial stalker.
Yes. Right. It's the progression of Gossip Girl in 2023. This is the real Gossip Girl reboot that we were.
This is who Dan Humphrey would have become.
Oh my gosh, seriously. Ugh, good times.
What else did you find?
Okay, so there's also this theme that we see play out around adult friendships, which is something that we've talked about on our Wishing You Well podcast. And a couple of things. So I think in episode 1, when Malcolm brings Joe to Sundry House and starts introducing Joe around, he introduces him to Simon, the artist, and Simon says, I already have too many friends, so like come back to me when one of them dies. And I was thinking like, that is like so crass, but also in a lot of ways relatable. Like, like it's really hard to maintain friendships, and sometimes like adding another relationship, another kind of like relationship that you need to be responsible for can feel so daunting. And there definitely are relationships where it's like, no more new friends. Like, let's be good with what we have. So I chuckled a little bit about that. But I was also kind of reflecting on like this group of people, Kate, Simon, Roald, Lady Phoebe, Gemma. Yes. Like, that they've been friends, it sounds like, since college, or maybe sometime before, in terms of Kate and Roald. And they are still so linked to one another. And yet clearly, especially as we see like toward the later part of this season, like they really don't maybe have a lot in common. And we really see that with Kate and Gemma.
The one who died.
Yes. Yeah. And even Phoebe, I think at times we see her react to Gemma as like, oh gosh, this is embarrassing, or this is problematic. And I think even Reese had said something at a certain point in reaction to Joe. I think Joe basically asked, like, why are you friends with them? And it's like, well, we've just known each other for so long. And it seems like they haven't.
He said they'd been there for me when I needed them.
Yes. Like this kind of sense of being indebted to people and having this kind of investment in a relationship. And it's kept them all connected, where it doesn't actually seem to be really serving some of them as much. They've outgrown each other. And that happens. Of course that happens. Who you are when you're 18 meeting in college is really different than who you are when you're, I don't know how old they are, late 20s, 30s. So I just kind of appreciated seeing that aspect of things.
Well, and I like that you said that they seem to be linked. Like they're not close because a lot of them dislike each other. But yeah, they just still continue to keep this friendship going. And I wonder how that's really working for them, how it's really making any sense to any of them, or most of them anyway, and why they continue to hang on just because of, the good times that we used to have, and not so much for, well, who they are now, who they've grown to be, and who I've grown to be,
right.
Is vastly different than what partying with you in college was like. I needed a different friend then than I need now. And none of them are really reevaluating that. No. And it's also, as you're talking, making me think of our gossip episode of Wishing You Well, where it's like, how could you actually be friends with any of these people when they clearly all talk shit behind one another's back? Like, how could you actually get close to someone that isn't really trustworthy? And so it just made me like think again, like kind of evaluating the friendships. I'll use that like loosely in quotes, because it doesn't actually seem like they're friends. They seem a little bit more like acquaintances or frenemies. Yeah. The only one that's really reevaluating it is Reese. And he's just, instead of unfriending them, he's just killing them.
Yes. So good intention, bad execution.
Yeah. Well, I am excited for part 2 to come out. When does it come out?
March 9th. But wait, I wanted to It's so soon. I wanted to say one more thing that like was more like a funny thing, which is Joe is a professor this season. Mm-hmm. And again, since I like did a rewatch, I've been like, I'm familiar with what he looked like pre-professor days. And he has like completely cosplayed into a professor. Like he's, I mean, maybe the longer hair and beard is like to not be Joe Goldberg anymore, but like it's like textbook professor garb. And it just like made me laugh because, as you know, I recently started teaching at a university, and I like with all the imposter syndrome, literally Googled, really actually TikToked like professor outfits. And I like I like ordered and wore exactly what TikTok told me I should wear. And so I felt like, okay, Joe, like I get it. You feel like a fraud and a fake, which you are, but same. And so like kind of just that like relatable idea of like having some imposter syndrome and like maybe leaning a little bit too much into a stereotype in order to feel like more comfortable or competent.
Oh, true. It's like Elle Woods at Harvard, and she shows up. She wears glasses. Like she doesn't wear glasses, and she puts her hair up, and she puts this like overcoat on that actually ends up being like, I don't know, mermaidy green, glistening.
Yes.
Kind of smoking jacket, Hugh Hefner looking thing instead of. But to her, that seemed like what a serious law student would wear.
Yes.
And yeah.
It's so funny. Have you ever done that? Like when you were starting as a therapist, like did you think about like therapist outfits?
Are you kidding? Of course. Well, first I thought when I was in grad school, I was scared that I was going to be too young to see people that were older than me. And I remember asking my supervisor at school, like, should I wear my glasses tomorrow? They make me look a little older. And she was like, no, Catherine, you need to be yourself.
Yeah, it's such a normal tendency. I know. I was like thinking about that too. Like I totally, because I was young when I started too. Like I was playing dress up in a sense. But that does, as your supervisor had said, like does get in the way of like letting us be who we are. But it's really freaking uncomfortable to be who we are when we're new at something.
Well, when you start out with anything new, you just think you're like playing that person. You're not really them yet. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I'm in grad school. I'm playing therapist. I don't know what I'm doing yet.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh. Well, I suppose we have a lot to see what's in store for Professor Jonathan, aka Joe.
Such a change of a name.
So March 9th, it's back on Netflix. And I guess we will react to the conclusion. But as I said, I'm kind of, there's really three main outcomes. Either Joe dies, he gets caught, or he just like kind of goes on as though like he just continues on. And I really
continues to be Joe.
Yeah, continues to be Joe. And like, there is a part of me that like wants some sort of redemption arc for him. Something, but I guess we'll see.
You're nice. I'd rather him get what he deserves.
What is that?
To be determined.
Fair. Okay. I guess we'll see what happens on March 9th.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we will continue giving our therapist take to what we're seeing on TV, whether that's season 27 of The Bachelor, the newest season of Outer Banks, Succession, and of course, season 4 of You. So also let us know in the comments what else we should be watching. I mean, it's a dull time for TV. So like, let us know what else is out there so we can give you our therapist take on that too. Okay. Bye.
Bye.